When a billionaire CEO out for a walk in the park gets suddenly attacked by a tiny dog, its owner, an angry little boy, says, "This is for breaking my mom's heart." The man turns around, annoyed by the child's nonsense accusation. Before freezing in shock, that boy looks like a mini version of him. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Andrew Royce moved through the park with the detached air of a man who didn't belong there. The crisp autumn air was pleasant enough, but he barely noticed it. The rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his polished shoes was a rare sound in his world. Normally, he spent his time in boardrooms and private offices, where decisions worth billions were made over hushed conversations and firm handshakes. Taking a walk was foreign to him, a forced exercise in unwinding, but even here, the weight of his responsibilities clung to him. His mind was already wandering back to the emails he hadn't answered, the deals that needed closing, the empire that wouldn't run itself. Then, without warning, a sudden flurry of movement snapped him back to reality. Something small, fast, and absurdly aggressive launched itself at his ankle. A sharp yipping filled the air, followed by the unmistakable pressure of tiny teeth sinking into the leather of his ridiculously expensive loafers. "What the?" Andrew stumbled back, staring down at the pint-sized menace attacking him. A dog. A comically tiny, scruffy thing with wiry fur and an oversized attitude, its little jaws latched onto his shoe as if it had been personally wronged by him. Before he could react, a furious voice rang out. "Get him, Peanut! This is for breaking my mom's heart!" Andrew's head snapped up, his irritation momentarily eclipsed by confusion. A child, small, red-faced, and radiating sheer indignation, stood a few feet away, fists clenched, eyes blazing. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, yet he wielded the kind of righteous fury Andrew had only ever encountered in boardroom rivals who had just lost a major deal. The boy's face was contorted in outrage, but Andrew barely registered his words. His attention had snagged on something else, something that froze him in place. The kid looked exactly like him. It wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was undeniable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same piercing blue eyes, the same stubborn set to his jaw. Andrew felt the ground shift beneath him, reality momentarily twisting as he processed what he was seeing. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but all it found was a deafening silence. Peanut, evidently pleased with his efforts, finally released Andrew's shoe and trotted back to his tiny commander, who bent down and scooped the dog up with a huff of satisfaction. "That's what you get," the boy declared, shooting Andrew a look of pure contempt. Andrew took a slow step forward, still staring, still trying to comprehend what was happening. "Kid," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended, "what did you just say?" The boy crossed his arms. "I said you broke my mom's heart. And you deserve that." He gave a firm nod, as if he had just delivered an irrefutable truth. Andrew blinked. His brain was still tangled in the absurdity of the situation, the attack, the accusation, the fact that this child looked like he had been plucked straight from Andrew's own childhood photos. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more careful. The boy hesitated, clearly wary of engaging with him further. But then he lifted his chin defiantly. "Oliver." Andrew inhaled sharply. "Oliver." The name barely had time to settle before a new voice entered the mix. "Oliver Whitmore, what on earth are you?" A woman appeared, breathless and clearly in a hurry, her face twisted in alarm. Andrew turned toward her, and the moment their eyes met, the world seemed to stop again, just for a fraction of a second. Emily. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. The past, which he had so neatly packed away, came rushing back all at once. He hadn't seen her in years, but there she was, standing a few feet away, looking like she had just seen a ghost. She still had that same rich chestnut hair, though it was pulled into a messy ponytail now, loose strands framing a face that had once been so familiar to him. Her wide brown eyes, always expressive, were filled with something unreadable as they flickered between him and Oliver. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Andrew finally found his voice, though it felt strange in his throat. Emily. Her name came out softer than he had intended, and something flickered in her eyes before she quickly masked it. Andrew, she said, her tone carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in the way her shoulders had stiffened. He looked at Oliver again. His mind was still struggling to process what was in front of him, but the pieces were clicking into place far too quickly. Is he? Andrew's voice faltered, his usual composure shaken. He tried again, his throat dry. Is he mine? Emily's lips parted slightly, as if the question had caught her off guard. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. She reached for Oliver's hand, pulling him protectively to her side. We need to go, she said, her voice clipped. Emily, wait. But she was already turning away, already leading Oliver toward the exit of the park. Oliver glanced back just once, his expression still full of defiance, but now mixed with something else. Curiosity. Confusion. Then they were gone. Andrew stood there, rooted to the spot, the sounds of the park fading into a dull hum around him. The wind rustled the leaves, peanuts yipping grew distant, and yet Andrew remained frozen. His heart was hammering in a way it hadn't in years. Oliver. His son. There was no other explanation. And Emily had never told him. Andrew remained standing long after Emily and Oliver had disappeared from sight, the sounds of the park dulling into an indistinct hum around him. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, was sluggish, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The boy Oliver, his son. There was no mistaking it. The resemblance was too strong, the timeline too perfectly aligned. And Emily. Emily had known. She had known all this time and had never told him. His fists clenched at his sides as his pulse pounded in his ears. He had been ambushed in more ways than one today, first by a tiny dog, then by an accusation he hadn't been prepared for, and finally by the realization that he had a child he never knew existed. The very idea sent a sharp pang through his chest. How could she have kept this from him? How had he not known? He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think rationally. He needed answers. He needed Emily to explain. He started walking in the direction she had gone, scanning the park for any sign of her, but she was already gone. His frustration grew. He had let her slip away once before, years ago, when he had made the decision to put his career above everything else. Back then, he had convinced himself it was the right thing to do. Now, standing here with the weight of a son he never knew pressing against his ribs, he wasn't so sure. He turned on his heel, his next steps clear. He needed to find Emily. He needed to know why she had never told him. And most importantly, he needed to know Oliver. The ride back to his office was silent, his driver wisely refraining from making conversation. Andrew barely noticed the towering skyline of the city as it blurred past. His thoughts were rooted firmly in the past, in memories of Emily, flashes of laughter, of stolen moments, of whispered promises that had faded into nothing when he had walked away. He had been younger then, too focused on the next deal, the next expansion, too convinced that love was an obstacle rather than something worth holding on to. His phone sat heavy in his pocket, but he didn't reach for it. He had no idea if she still had the same number. After all these years, was she even reachable? Had she thought of calling him, even once, when Oliver was born? Had she ever debated telling him the truth, or had she made up her mind from the start that he wouldn't be a part of their lives? By the time the car pulled up to his office building, Andrew had already made up his mind. He wasn't leaving this alone. Inside, his assistant, Marcus, immediately sensed something was off. Andrew barely acknowledged him as he strode past, heading straight for his private office. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the afternoon," he said without looking back. Marcus hesitated. "All of them?" "Yes. And get me everything you can find on an Emily Whitmore." Marcus didn't question it. He never did. That was why Andrew kept him around, efficient, reliable, and smart enough not to pry. Andrew shut the office door behind him and exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. He needed information, needed to know where she lived, where she worked, how she had managed to stay invisible for so many years. It wasn't long before Marcus returned, a folder in hand. "She's living in the city," he said, placing it on Andrew's desk. "Works at a small cafe downtown. No significant online presence, but there are some basic records, bills, rental agreements, that sort of thing. Looks like she's been here for a while." Andrew flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. Her address was listed at the top. A quiet neighborhood, nothing like the world he lived in. The fact that she was working in a cafe rather than pursuing the career she had once dreamed of caught his attention. Emily had been ambitious, talented, she could have done anything. Had raising Oliver alone held her back? Something tightened in his chest. He had walked away from her life once, but now, he had a responsibility. He wasn't the same man he had been back then. He had built an empire, made a name for himself, and now, all of that seemed irrelevant compared to the fact that there was a little boy out there who had his eyes, his face, his blood. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "I'll be out for a while," he told Marcus as he strode toward the elevator. 20 minutes later, he was standing outside the cafe. It was a small, unassuming place tucked into a corner of the city, the kind of place he would have never noticed before. Through the large window, he spotted Emily moving between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease, her expression neutral as she took orders. She looked different from how he remembered. There was a tiredness in her eyes, a weight on her shoulders that hadn't been there before. But she was still Emily. He pushed open the door. The bell overhead jingled, but she didn't notice him at first. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. Then she turned, and the moment her eyes met his, the world seemed to pause. Her grip on the tray tightened. For a second she said nothing, just stared at him as if she couldn't believe he was standing there. Then, ever so slightly, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low. Andrew kept his gaze steady. "We need to talk." She exhaled sharply, looking around as if to see if anyone was watching. "This isn't the time or place," she muttered. "I'm not leaving until you answer my questions," he said, keeping his voice level. Emily's jaw tightened, but before she could say anything else, another voice cut in. "Mom?" Andrew turned just as Oliver appeared from the back of the cafe, holding a plate far too big for his small hands. His eyes flicked between them, confusion evident in his expression. Emily immediately moved to him, gently taking the plate from his hands. "Sweetheart, why don't you go finish your homework in the back?" Oliver frowned, but then his gaze settled on Andrew. His small face twisted into a scowl. "What is he doing here?" Andrew wasn't sure why, but the hostility in the boy's voice sent a sharp pang through him. He wanted to say something, but before he could, Emily turned to him, her expression set. "Leave, Andrew. Not until you tell me the truth." He shot back, his voice quiet but firm. She hesitated, but there was something in her eyes, something flickering, uncertain. Then, finally, she whispered, "You have no right to show up now. Not after all these years." Andrew's throat tightened. "That's not fair. I didn't even know." Emily's lips pressed together, as if she were holding back a storm of emotions. Then, with one last glance at Oliver, she shook her head. "Go, Andrew." And this time, as she turned her back on him, he realized that for the first time in years, he had absolutely no control over what happened next. Andrew left the cafe, but his mind never really stepped outside with him. His body went through the motions, walking to his car, nodding to the driver, staring blankly out the window as the city passed by, but his thoughts were still inside that small cafe, still locked onto the face of the little boy who had looked up at him with so much defiance, so much certainty that Andrew was the villain of his story. And maybe he was. Emily's words had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. "You have no right to show up now. Not after all these years." The weight of them pressed into his chest like a stone. He had been caught off guard, unprepared for the reality of what had just been thrown at him. A son. He had a son. The thought was almost too big to process. Andrew prided himself on being in control, always 10 steps ahead, but today, he had been blindsided. He didn't even remember the ride back to his office, but when he stepped out of the car and walked through the sleek glass doors of Royce Industries, the familiarity of his world settled around him like armor. Here, he was powerful. Here, no one ignored his calls or shut him out. And yet, for the first time in years, none of it seemed to matter. Marcus was waiting for him just outside his office. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes sharp, undoubtedly noticing the tension in Andrew's posture. Andrew exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "Get me everything you can on Emily Whitmore," he said after a moment, his voice controlled, but not as steady as usual. Marcus blinked. "Emily Whitmore?" He clearly hadn't expected the request. "Yes. Now." Marcus hesitated for only a second before nodding and heading off, leaving Andrew alone in his office. He dropped into the chair behind his desk and stared at the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Normally, he found comfort in the view, his empire, his success laid out before him. But today, all he saw was a reflection of himself in the glass, a man who had let something important slip through his fingers without even realizing it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He thought about the past. Emily. Their relationship hadn't been long, but it had been real. He had met her before Royce Industries became the empire it was today. Back then, he had been ambitious, hungry, and willing to sacrifice anything to reach the top. She had been bright, full of life, challenging him in ways that no one else ever had. He had liked that about her. Maybe he had even loved it. But when the company demanded more of his time, when the late nights turned into early mornings, and every spare moment was consumed by the endless climb to success, he had made a decision. He told himself that love was a distraction, that Emily deserved someone who could give her more. So he let her go. No arguments. No long goodbyes. He had been so sure at the time that he was doing the right thing. Now, he wasn't so sure. Marcus returned an hour later with a manila folder. Andrew took it without a word, flipping it open as soon as the door shut behind his assistant. Emily Whitmore. 33. Single mother. Employed at a small cafe for the past 5 years. College degree in business administration, top of her class, but never pursued a corporate career. No known spouse. No significant financial assets. Andrew's jaw tightened. Emily had always been brilliant. She could have done anything, gone anywhere, built something for herself. But instead, she had ended up here, barely making ends meet. He flipped to the next page, his eyes scanning a list of addresses. She had moved twice in the past 10 years, always to modest apartments in quiet neighborhoods. No luxury. No stability. No help. And then there was Oliver. Andrew swallowed hard as he stared at the small school records attached to the file. Oliver Royce Whitmore. His last name was there, buried between Emily's, but he had never known. Report cards, school fees, medical history, it was all there in black and white. His son had been living a whole life while Andrew had been in boardrooms and business meetings, completely unaware. Guilt twisted in his chest. He sat back, pressing a hand against his mouth. He had spent years believing that his decisions had only affected himself, that walking away from Emily had been a clean break, a necessary sacrifice. But he hadn't just walked away from her. He had walked away from them. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Andrew wasn't sure what to do next. He had spent his whole life making calculated decisions, weighing risks, ensuring that every move he made put him ahead. But there was no strategy for this. No business plan. What did you do when you realized you had missed the first 7 years of your child's life? He thought about Oliver's face, the fire in his eyes when he had yelled at him in the park. This is for breaking my mom's heart. The kid had been so sure, so convinced that Andrew was the villain. Maybe he was. Andrew closed the folder and exhaled. He had two options. He could walk away again, pretend that today had never happened. He could go back to his life, his company, his carefully controlled world where emotions didn't dictate his choices. Or he could fight. For Emily. For Oliver. For the second chance he hadn't even known he needed. His hand tightened around the folder. There was no choice at all. This time, he wasn't walking away. Andrew sat in his car outside the cafe the next morning, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The folder lay on the passenger seat beside him, though he no longer needed it. He had read through every page, memorized every detail. He knew Emily's work schedule now, knew exactly when she would be here, moving between tables, pouring coffee, and pretending she wasn't carrying the weight of something much bigger than a tray of plates. He wasn't a man who wasted time. He had spent the night thinking about his next move, and this was it. He wasn't going to let this conversation wait any longer. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket out of habit, though he already felt out of place in this quiet, unassuming part of the city. The cafe was small, local, the kind of place where the regulars all knew each other's names. It smelled like fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, a scent that should have been comforting but only made the tension in his stomach coil tighter. He pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell overhead drawing a few curious glances from the patrons inside. And then he saw her. Emily was at the counter, scribbling something on a notepad. Her hair was pulled back, strands falling loose around her face. She looked up, ready to take another order, until her eyes landed on him. For a moment, she didn't react. No gasp, no sharp intake of breath, just a blank stare that quickly hardened into something cold. Her fingers curled around the pen in her hand, knuckles white. She wasn't surprised to see him. She had been expecting this. Andrew didn't wait for her to tell him to leave. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Is Oliver mine?" The words came out steady, controlled, but there was an urgency beneath them, something raw. Emily's jaw tightened. She glanced quickly around the cafe, as if checking to see if anyone was paying attention. She let out a sharp breath, tossing her notepad onto the counter. "Not here." She turned and walked through the back door leading into the cafe's small storage area. He followed without hesitation. The door swung shut behind them, muting the distant hum of conversation from the customers outside. The space was small, crowded with shelves of supplies, sacks of flour and coffee beans stacked neatly against the walls. Emily crossed her arms, her back straight, shoulders squared. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He's yours." Andrew felt his chest tighten, even though he had already known the answer. Hearing her say it made it real in a way that nothing else had. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Are you serious? You left, Andrew. You walked away like I was just another thing on your checklist, something to cross out and move on from. I wasn't going to track you down and beg you to care." His stomach twisted. He had expected anger. He hadn't expected it to sting this much. "I had a right to know," he said, his voice quieter now. Emily shook her head, disbelief flickering across her face. "A right? A right? You don't get to show up years later and suddenly demand to be part of his life. Where were you when I was raising him alone? Where were you when I was up at 3 a.m, wondering how I was going to pay rent? When Oliver was sick and I had to choose between calling into work and losing a paycheck or leaving him with a sitter I couldn't afford?" She took a step closer, her voice low and shaking. "You don't get to say you had a right to anything, Andrew. You made your choice. I made mine." Guilt hit him like a weight to the chest. He opened his mouth, but she wasn't done. "You think you can just waltz in here, demand answers, and what? Make yourself feel better?" Her eyes were sharp, accusing. "Is that what this is? A guilt trip? You found out you have a son, and now you want to play dad because it makes you feel like less of a selfish bastard?" Andrew clenched his jaw. He had spent his life negotiating, controlling conversations, bending situations to his will. But none of that mattered here. This wasn't a deal to be made. This was real. "It's not about clearing my conscience," he said finally. "It's about Oliver. I need to know him. And whether you like it or not, he has a right to know me." Emily let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "You think that's up to you? You don't just get to decide you're ready now, Andrew. You don't get to walk in and turn his life upside down because you feel like it." He stepped forward, closing some of the space between them. "I'm not leaving this time, Emily. I swear to you, I'm not walking away." She met his gaze, searching his face for something, maybe sincerity, maybe proof that he meant it. After a long moment, she shook her head again, but there was something less certain in her eyes now. "Then prove it," she said, her voice softer, but no less firm. "Because I will not let you hurt him. I will not let you break his heart the way you broke mine." The words settled between them, heavy and final. Andrew knew she wasn't going to change her mind today. But she hadn't slammed the door shut completely, either. There was still something there, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And he was going to find a way through. Andrew wasn't used to being tested. He was a man who made decisions, closed deals, and dictated outcomes. But Emily had thrown down a challenge, and whether she realized it or not, he had accepted it. She had made it clear, words meant nothing. Promises were empty unless backed by action. And so, for the first time in his life, Andrew found himself in unfamiliar territory, proving himself to a 7-year-old with a vendetta. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. 2 days after their confrontation at the cafe, he found himself standing outside Emily's apartment building, staring at the peeling paint on the door, and wondering how many times she had struggled to pay rent while he had been signing billion-dollar contracts. He shook off the thought and knocked. The door opened, but it wasn't Emily standing there. It was Oliver. The boy blinked up at him, then scowled. "Oh, it's you." Andrew exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Expecting someone else?" "Nope." Oliver crossed his arms, his small frame radiating judgment. "But Mom's not here. So whatever dramatic speech you had planned, you can go ahead and take it back to your fancy office." Andrew bit back a smirk. The kid had guts. "I'm not here for a speech. I'm here for you." Oliver narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Andrew hesitated. He could have gone with something polished, something calculated, but it didn't feel right. So instead, he said the truth. "Because I should have been here a long time ago." Oliver's expression flickered, something unreadable flashing across his face, but it was gone in an instant. He scoffed. "That's what they all say." Andrew frowned. "They all?" Oliver shrugged. "Other kids' dads. The ones who come back after disappearing and try to pretend they care." The words hit harder than Andrew expected. This wasn't just about him. Oliver had seen this story play out before, maybe not firsthand, but enough to believe the ending was inevitable. Andrew inhaled, steadying himself. "I don't expect you to believe me overnight." "Good," Oliver said, unimpressed. "Because I don't." Andrew exhaled through his nose. "All right, kid. You want proof? Fine. How about a deal?" Oliver raised a suspicious eyebrow. "What kind of deal?" "You test me. Give me something impossible to do. If I quit, you win, and I leave you alone. But if I don't, you have to give me a chance." Oliver studied him for a long moment, then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. A dangerous grin. "All right," he said, stepping aside and whistling sharply. "Then meet Peanut." Andrew didn't have time to react before a tiny, wiry ball of chaos came barreling out from inside the apartment, teeth bared, legs moving at lightning speed. The little dog stopped just short of crashing into Andrew's shoes and let out a shrill bark that was far too aggressive for its size. Andrew stared. "This is Peanut?" "This is Peanut," Oliver said smugly. "And if you really want a chance with me, you're walking him." Andrew glanced at the tiny menace, who was still growling as if debating whether or not to take another bite out of his shoes. He lifted his gaze back to Oliver, who looked far too entertained. "That's it?" Andrew asked, unimpressed. Oliver snorted. "Oh, you think that's it?" He grabbed Peanut's leash from the hook by the door and shoved it into Andrew's hand. "Come on, big guy. Let's see what you've got." 5 minutes later, Andrew regretted every single decision that had led to this moment. Peanut was not a normal dog. Peanut was a demon. The moment they stepped onto the sidewalk, the tiny creature took off, dragging Andrew forward with a speed that should have been impossible for a dog that small. Andrew stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing as Peanut zigzagged wildly, lunging at pigeons, barking at parked cars, and for some inexplicable reason, trying to chase a motorcycle. Oliver walked beside him, arms crossed, watching with obvious delight. "This isn't so bad," Andrew muttered, tugging lightly on the leash. Peanut stopped dead in his tracks. Andrew frowned. "What?" Before he could finish his sentence, Peanut launched himself in the opposite direction, nearly yanking Andrew's arm out of its socket. He stumbled again, cursing under his breath, while Oliver burst into laughter. "Oh man," Oliver gasped between wheezes. "You look ridiculous." Andrew glared at him, then down at Peanut, who was staring up at him with wild eyes, ready to bolt again. "This is not a normal dog." "Nope," Oliver agreed. "But you made the deal. No quitting, remember?" Andrew sighed. He tightened his grip on the leash, planting his feet firmly. Peanut growled, testing his strength. "All right, you tiny terror," Andrew muttered. "Let's try this again." They continued down the sidewalk, Peanut still jerking the leash every few seconds, but Andrew was slowly, very slowly, getting the hang of it. Oliver watched him carefully, arms still crossed, his amusement fading into something more thoughtful. By the time they returned to the apartment, Andrew's clothes were disheveled, his dignity was in shambles, and Peanut looked smug. Oliver nodded in approval. "Not bad." Andrew exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So? Do I pass?" Oliver tilted his head, considering. "I don't hate you," he admitted. "Yet." Andrew smirked. "I'll take it." Later that night, Oliver sat at the kitchen table, pretending to do homework while Emily moved around the apartment. "Mom?" he asked suddenly. Emily glanced up. "Yeah?" Oliver twirled his pencil between his fingers, staring down at his notebook. "Do you think he really cares?" Emily paused, looking at him carefully. She didn't have an answer. Andrew had never been a patient man. He was used to control, to solving problems before they spiraled. But no amount of money, power, or careful strategy could prepare him for the helplessness that gripped him the moment his phone rang that evening. It was Emily. She never called him. Not once since he'd reappeared in her life. Their conversations had been cold, clipped, always on her terms. But now, her voice was different. Shaken. Rushed. "It's Oliver," she said, breathless. "He's burning up. He collapsed. I'm taking him to Mercy General." Andrew's heart slammed against his ribs. He was already moving, grabbing his keys, shoving on his jacket. "I'll meet you there." He didn't give her time to argue. The drive to the hospital was a blur, his fingers gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles turned white. His thoughts raced, flashing between the image of Oliver's defiant little smirk and the fear in Emily's voice. He didn't know the details. Didn't know what was wrong. And that terrified him more than anything. When he pulled into the hospital parking lot, he barely remembered how he got there. He moved on instinct, shoving through the emergency room doors, scanning the crowded waiting area until his eyes landed on Emily. She was pacing near the front desk, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale with worry. Andrew crossed the room in seconds. "Where is he?" Emily turned, startled. For once, there was no fight in her eyes. Just exhaustion. Fear. They took him back already. They're running tests. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to know why this was happening, why Oliver had collapsed, why no one was telling them anything. But the words got caught in his throat when he saw the way Emily's fingers trembled as she rubbed her arms. So instead, he said, "We'll figure this out." Emily blinked at him, her walls momentarily crumbling. She looked like she wanted to believe him, like she needed to. Then a nurse appeared. "Family for Oliver Whitmore?" They both stepped forward at the same time. The nurse's eyes flickered between them, confused, but didn't question it. "He's stable for now," she said. "Still running tests, but you can see him." Andrew followed Emily down the hall, every step feeling heavier. Then they reached the room. Oliver was small to begin with, but lying in that hospital bed, he looked impossibly tiny, swallowed by the sterile white sheets, and four taped to his arm. His face was too pale, his messy hair damp with sweat. Emily rushed to his side, brushing his forehead with trembling fingers. "Hey, baby," she whispered. "I'm here." Andrew stood frozen in the doorway. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took in the sight of his son, so fragile, so still. He had never felt more useless in his life. Then Emily looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. "Are you just going to stand there?" He swallowed hard and stepped inside, moving to the other side of the bed. His fingers twitched at his sides before, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand over Oliver's. The small fingers beneath his own barely twitched in response, but they were warm. Alive. Andrew let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Nurses came and went. Emily didn't speak, but she didn't tell him to leave either. She just sat beside Oliver, one hand resting protectively on his arm. At some point, a doctor came in. "His fever's coming down," he said, flipping through a chart. "It looks like a viral infection that hit him hard. We'll keep monitoring him overnight, but he should be okay." Andrew exhaled, his shoulders slumping in relief. Emily let out a shaky breath, closing her eyes for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." The doctor left, and silence settled over the room once more. Andrew didn't move from his chair. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Hours later, as the hospital dimmed into quiet, Oliver stirred. Andrew straightened instantly. Emily leaned forward, brushing his hair back. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're okay." Oliver's lashes fluttered, his lips parting slightly. His gaze was unfocused, drowsy. Then, slowly, his small fingers curled around Andrew's hand. "Dad?" The word was barely more than a whisper, but it sent a shockwave through Andrew's entire body. Emily inhaled sharply. Andrew tightened his grip, his throat thick. "I'm here, buddy," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Oliver's fingers twitched. A tiny, exhausted smile flickered across his lips before he drifted back to sleep. Andrew let out a breath, staring at their joined hands. Then he felt Emily's gaze on him. When he looked up, she wasn't glaring. She wasn't shutting him out. There was something else in her eyes now, something hesitant, something disarmed. She swallowed. "I didn't think you had this in you." Andrew's voice was rough when he answered. "Neither did I." Andrew had never been one to hesitate when making decisions. It was what had built his empire: calculated risks, ruthless efficiency, knowing when to push and when to walk away. But sitting in that hospital room, watching the steady rise and fall of Oliver's chest, something shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, his ambition felt like a chain instead of a weapon. Oliver had called him Dad. The word had settled deep inside him, both foreign and familiar, something he hadn't realized he needed until it had come from that small, tired voice. And for the first time in years, Andrew wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, or how to stay ahead of the competition. He was thinking about soccer games, science fairs, bedtime stories, all the things he had missed, all the things he wasn't willing to miss anymore. Emily had fallen asleep in the chair beside the hospital bed, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Andrew had stayed awake, watching Oliver, holding on to his tiny hand, promising himself that he wouldn't let his son down again. He didn't care what it took. He would be in Oliver's life. And that meant something had to change. By the time morning came and Oliver's fever had fully broken, Andrew already knew what he had to do. 2 days later, the world was in shock. The headline hit every major news outlet within minutes of his announcement. Ethan Caldwell steps down as CEO, effective immediately. The business world exploded with speculation. Analysts debated his reasons, shareholders panicked, and competitors saw an opportunity. But Andrew didn't care. Sitting in his penthouse office for what would be the last time, he watched as his assistant Marcus paced back and forth, looking like he had just witnessed a natural disaster. "Andrew, this is insane. The board is scrambling. They don't know what to do. You're just walking away?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, watching Marcus with something close to amusement. "I don't recall asking for a vote of confidence." Marcus threw his hands up. "That's because you didn't. You didn't consult the board, the investors, anyone. You just woke up today and decided you're done?" "No." Andrew exhaled slowly, glancing out the window at the skyline. "I decided that 2 nights ago. When I realized there are things in my life that matter more than this." Marcus blinked, catching the shift in his tone. "This is about the kid." Andrew didn't deny it. "Yeah. It is." For once, Marcus didn't argue. He just shook his head and muttered, "I hope he's worth it." Andrew smiled to himself. "He is." The media storm raged on for days, but Andrew ignored it. He had more important things to focus on. A week later, he knocked on Emily's apartment door again. This time, when she opened it, she didn't look surprised. Just cautious. "I heard about the resignation," she said, crossing her arms. "Didn't think you were capable of making a decision that wasn't about money." Andrew smirked. "Turns out, I'm full of surprises." Emily studied him carefully. "Why?" He knew she wasn't asking why he was here. She was asking why he had given it all up. Why a man like him, who had once walked away from her without hesitation, would suddenly decide to change everything. "Because I want to be in his life," Andrew said simply. "Not as some distant, part-time dad who shows up when it's convenient. I want to be there for the big moments. And the small ones." He met her gaze. "I want to be his father." Emily's expression softened, but she still looked skeptical. "And what happens when you get bored? When this stops being exciting for you?" Andrew shook his head. "This isn't a deal, Emily. This isn't a business move. It's my life. His life. I know I don't deserve trust from you yet. But I'm going to earn it." She was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "So what exactly are you planning to do now? Retire and start making peanut butter sandwiches for school lunches?" Andrew grinned. "Funny you should say that. I was actually thinking I'd start with something easier." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Taking him out for the day." Her lips parted in surprise, but Oliver's voice cut in before she could respond. "I get a day off from school." They both turned to see Oliver standing in the hallway, eyes wide with interest. Andrew smirked. "Only if your mom agrees." Oliver turned to Emily with his best innocent face. "Can I go?" Emily sighed but didn't fight it. "Fine. But no junk food, and he needs to be home by dinner." Andrew put a hand over his heart. "Scout's honor." Emily rolled her eyes. "You were never a scout." Oliver grabbed his jacket, already grinning. "Let's go before she changes her mind." Andrew had expected the day to be a test. But instead, it was fun. He took Oliver to the arcade, where the kid proceeded to beat him at almost every game. They got ice cream, not technically junk food, he reasoned. They went to a bookstore, where Oliver picked out a comic and made Andrew buy one too. And by the time the afternoon sun was starting to set, Oliver had stopped side-eyeing him like a stranger and started treating him like someone who might actually belong. They sat on a park bench, watching the ducks in the pond. Oliver licked his ice cream, then glanced at Andrew thoughtfully. You really quit your job? Yep. Oliver frowned. So, you don't have any money now? Andrew snorted. I still have money. Just not the job. Oliver looked relieved. Good. Because this ice cream was expensive. Andrew laughed, shaking his head. A pause. Then Oliver said, quieter this time. So, you're really staying? Andrew met his gaze, serious. I'm really staying. Oliver hesitated for only a second before nodding. Okay, Dad. The word was softer this time, easier, like it was something he was getting used to. Andrew swallowed past the lump in his throat. Okay, kid. That night, when he brought Oliver home, Emily watched them from the doorway, her arms crossed, something unreadable in her expression. She didn't say anything at first, just looked between them. Then, finally, she shook her head with a small, almost reluctant smile. You're really doing this, huh? Andrew smiled back. Yeah. I am. Months passed, and somehow, against all odds, Andrew Royce learned how to be a father. It didn't happen overnight. There were stumbles, missteps, and plenty of times where he questioned whether he was doing anything right. But every morning, when Oliver woke up and didn't look at him like a stranger anymore, when his son started calling him Dad without hesitation, Andrew knew he had made the right choice. His days were no longer consumed by endless meetings and stock reports. Instead, he found himself attending soccer games, sitting on uncomfortable bleachers with other parents, cheering like his life depended on it whenever Oliver made a pass or blocked a goal. He still wasn't entirely sure of the rules, but Oliver didn't care. What mattered was that he was there. School events became a new part of his routine. Andrew had spent years making speeches in front of powerful business figures, but nothing had prepared him for standing in a crowded auditorium for Family Day, sitting in a tiny chair meant for first graders while Oliver grinned at him like he had won some unspoken competition. It was in those moments that it truly sank in. He had missed so much, but he wasn't missing anything else. Even Peanut, the tiny terror who had once tried to take a chunk out of his shoe, had begrudgingly accepted his presence. The first time Andrew had walked into Emily's apartment, and Peanut hadn't immediately tried to murder him, Oliver had gasped dramatically. "Oh my God!" Oliver had whispered. He didn't bark. "Mom, call someone. I think Peanut's broken." Emily had laughed, shaking her head as Peanut sniffed Andrew's shoe, gave an unimpressed huff, and trotted away. "Guess he finally got tired of fighting me," Andrew had said, smirking. Oliver had leaned forward, squinting at Peanut like he was searching for answers. Then, with all the seriousness of a world leader making a grand announcement, he had declared, "Peanut forgives you. So I guess I do too." Andrew had felt something warm settle in his chest at those words. Emily had laughed softly, and when Andrew glanced at her, she was already watching him, something unreadable but softer in her gaze. They never rushed anything between them. Whatever was happening between him and Emily, it wasn't forced. They co-parented. They argued over bedtime routines and Oliver's growing obsession with building elaborate pillow forts in the living room. They learned to work together, to trust each other again in small, careful steps. Andrew didn't push for more. He knew trust wasn't rebuilt in a day. But some nights, when he stayed a little longer after dropping Oliver off, when they shared quiet conversations on the couch while Oliver slept, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't something they had to keep running from. One evening, as they left Oliver's soccer practice together, Oliver walked between them, kicking a loose rock along the sidewalk. "So," Oliver said suddenly, breaking the silence, "am I ever gonna get a brother or a sister or what?" Andrew nearly choked on his own breath. Emily, on the other hand, snorted. "You just got a dad, and now you're making demands?" Oliver shrugged. "I like having a family." Andrew cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, that's not really." But Emily cut him off, smirking. "Let's take things one step at a time, all right, kid?" Oliver rolled his eyes like they were the ones being ridiculous. "Fine. But I'm just saying. Think about it. Andrew chuckled, shaking his head. You really don't hold back, do you? Nope, Oliver said proudly. They reached the end of the sidewalk where Andrew's car was parked. Normally, this would be where he said goodnight, but tonight, he hesitated. He looked at Emily, then at Oliver, and something in him felt at peace in a way it never had before. Oliver sighed dramatically, turning to his mom. Can we get pizza tonight? Emily smirked. I don't know. Maybe Andrew has plans. Andrew caught the flicker of something teasing in her expression, an unspoken challenge. He smiled. I do, he said easily. Pizza sounds like the perfect plan. And just like that, they turned back toward the apartment, walking together, this time, as a family. Andrew had spent years chasing things that never really mattered. He had measured success in numbers, in acquisitions, in how many headlines bore his name. He had believed, once, that his purpose was to build an empire, to carve out a legacy in boardrooms and skyscrapers. But now, as he sat in Emily's living room with Oliver curled up next to him, half asleep after devouring his weight in pizza, he realized that this quiet, simple moment, was the only legacy that truly mattered. Oliver mumbled something incoherent against his arm, shifting sleepily, his tiny body warm against Andrew's side. Andrew adjusted the blanket draped over him, careful not to wake him. Emily, sitting across from them, watched with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something softer, something that Andrew didn't dare name just yet. You know, she said after a while, voice quiet in the dim light of the room. I never thought you'd really stay. Andrew glanced at her, holding her gaze. I didn't either, he admitted. But I didn't know what I was missing. Emily exhaled, shaking her head with a small smile. He loves you, you know. He doesn't say it, but he does. A lump formed in Andrew's throat, too big to swallow down. I love him, too. The words were easy now. They felt natural. True. She nodded, looking down at Oliver, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing his hair. I don't regret keeping him. Not for a second. But there were nights I used to wonder if I made the right call not telling you. Andrew inhaled deeply. He could have been angry about that. He could have resented her for it. But the truth was, he had been a different man back then. He had been someone who might not have stayed. Who might not have cared the way he should have. He didn't blame her for doubting him. You did what you thought was best, he said softly. I can't change the past. But I can be here now. Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her gaze shifted. The walls she had built, the careful distance she had kept between them, were still there, but they were weaker now. Not impenetrable. Not impossible. Andrew didn't need to rush it. He had time. He had spent his entire life running, always focused on the next thing, the next deal, the next opportunity. But for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't waiting for something bigger or better. He was here. And that was enough. As Emily reached for the TV remote and the soft glow of a late-night movie filled the room, as Oliver sighed in his sleep and shifted closer, as Peanut snorted from his bed in the corner like the tiny menace he was, Andrew let himself breathe. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a man with power or wealth. He wasn't just a CEO or a businessman. He was Dad. And no amount of money could ever compare to that. The years passed in ways Andrew never expected. Time, once measured in profit margins and quarterly reports, became something else entirely, marked by birthdays, scraped knees, soccer trophies, and late-night homework sessions. At first, it was the little things. The way Oliver stopped hesitating before calling him Dad, how the once skeptical boy started seeking him out, sitting beside him on the couch instead of across the room. How Andrew had gone from an outsider to someone Oliver counted on, whether it was for picking him up from school, helping him build an impossible Lego set, or just being there at the end of a long day. Andrew found himself absorbed in fatherhood in ways he had never anticipated. He learned how to braid hair when Emily complained about Oliver's refusal to get a haircut. He sat through school plays where Oliver forgot half his lines but beamed proudly anyway. He spent Saturday mornings making terrible pancakes that Oliver ate with exaggerated groans before grinning and saying, "You're getting better, Dad." Barely. Time moved quickly, faster than he was prepared for. One day, he was watching Oliver chase Peanut around the park, laughing with the uninhibited joy of a child. The next, he was standing at the edge of a soccer field, watching his son, now a teenager, grit his teeth in concentration as he lined up a shot. The ball soared through the air, curling just past the goalie's outstretched hands. Goal! The crowd erupted, and Andrew felt something warm spread through his chest as Oliver turned, his grin wide, searching for him in the stands. When their eyes met, Andrew raised a fist in celebration, and Oliver smirked, giving a small nod before jogging back to his team. After the game, as they walked back to the car, Oliver bumped his shoulder against Andrew's. "You were pretty loud back there." Andrew smirked. "What can I say? I'm your biggest fan." Oliver rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he asked, "You coming to the team dinner? Wouldn't miss it." It was moments like this, small, seemingly insignificant moments, that reminded Andrew just how much had changed. How much he had changed. Emily was there for all of it, too. They never forced anything between them, but the years had softened whatever had been broken. Trust had been rebuilt, not overnight, but steadily. They shared a life now, one built on co-parenting, quiet understanding, and something that felt a lot like love, even if either of them had named it yet. Oliver grew. He went from a boy to a teenager, his voice deepening, his once small hands growing big enough to grip Andrew's shoulder in a half-hug instead of just reaching for his hand. And then, suddenly, he was 17, standing in the doorway in a graduation gown, fidgeting with the edges of the cap. "Does this look stupid?" Andrew smirked, crossing his arms. "You look like a kid who's about to make his old man proud." Oliver snorted. "You're always proud. Can you blame me?" The ceremony was a blur. Andrew sat beside Emily in the stands, clapping as Oliver walked across the stage, shaking the principal's hand. Emily wiped at her eyes discreetly, and Andrew pretended not to notice. Later, at the small party they threw at the apartment, Oliver stood beside Andrew on the balcony, staring out at the city. "So," Andrew said, nudging his shoulder, "any thoughts about what's next?" Oliver was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "College, I guess. Maybe business. Maybe not. Still figuring it out." Andrew nodded. "You've got time." Oliver glanced at him. "Did you know what you wanted at my age?" Andrew let out a breath, thinking back to the ambitious, ruthless young man he had been. "I thought I did." Oliver studied him. "But you don't regret anything?" Andrew turned to face him fully. "Not the things that led me here." Oliver looked away, nodding slowly. "I'm glad you didn't leave." Andrew felt his throat tighten. He reached out, gripping the back of Oliver's neck lightly, the way fathers do when words aren't enough. "Me too, kid." The years kept moving. One day, Andrew was watching Oliver struggle with his first car, cursing under his breath as he tried to change a tire. The next, he was standing in a dorm room, helping him unpack boxes, feeling a kind of loss he hadn't expected. And then, even later, he was shaking Oliver's hand before he left for his first job, feeling the weight of time settling in his chest. But through it all, there was never a moment where Andrew regretted stepping down from his old life. Because this, watching Oliver grow, being there for the milestones, the heartbreaks, the triumphs, was worth more than any empire he could have built. One evening, years later, when Oliver was home for a visit, they sat on the porch, drinking beers, because Oliver was old enough for that now, somehow. "You ever think about going back?" Oliver asked suddenly, nodding toward the city skyline in the distance. Andrew shook his head. "Nah. I already have everything I need." Oliver smirked. "Getting sentimental in your old age, huh?" Andrew chuckled. "Shut up and drink your beer." And as the sun set, Casting a golden glow over everything, Andrew leaned back, content. He had spent a lifetime chasing things he thought mattered. But in the end, the greatest thing he had ever built was a family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.